it's a relative. I'm hoping that we can be relatively informal in the sense that let's give the space for Andrew and then Emmanuel and Anna to each present and speak about the book, and hopefully Dan as and when he arrives, and then I will when we've had enough sort of discussion on that side, I'll open it up to Q&A, which please flag these your questions up in the chat, and we'll try and incorporate opportunity to feed into those. So let me, noting that Dan has not as yet arrived, Thomas Spear has raised his hand. Did you want to put a quick question in the chat before we formally start, Thomas? Or otherwise we can leave it to the discussion. Let's leave it to the discussion now. So okay, so let me start off and start off, if I may, Andrew, with an opportunity for you to go through with your review, which, as you said before, has in some ways also introduces the book quite nicely, but also has a few critiques of it there. So if you don't mind, Andrew, if we could start with your review, and then we'll go from there. Thank you.
Level. Another thought, though, is that Anna M. Day was involved right from the beginning, and it might be that, you know, she actually was involved in the research, unlike me, who was just, you know, heard a presentation by Dan in 2014, and then nothing till the book came out.
Yeah, no, I
so
just
I'm
think
not really the best person to summarize. I mean,
okay.
Dan would be far better, but Anna is another possibility if she's willing.
Well, okay. Anna, are you willing to jump in for Dan then in this context and sort of give some oversights on the book? She can't unmute. Janet, can you assist Anna? Yes.
Hi.
Hi, Anna. Yes. Sorry to jump to ask you this. Dan has not yet joined the meeting, and it would be
Andrew Coulson knows how to put me on the spot. I think.
Yes. I think so. Okay.
We also have Emmanuel Sully here, who was also part of the original team as well.
That's right. Yeah. Well, if perhaps you could start, Anna, and then Emmanuel could come in.
Yes,
and we could hear from Andrew. Yeah.
I can talk a little bit about the project as a whole, and I think one of the things that one of the reasons why Dan wanted me in this event is because my chapter provides somewhat of a contrast to the other chapters. So I can sort of say a bit about where and how the project evolved, but then maybe Emmanuel talk about his case, and then I can do my case as a sort of contrast, I think, to some of the broader findings.
That sounds like a good idea. And then we'll hear from Andrew after that.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go with that.
So from my perspective, you know, Dan came up with this project, sort of collected a few of us that he knew had been around Tanzania for quite a long time doing research, and those of us who'd been doing things like rural livelihoods research, involving household budget survey, that type of thing. And were we still involved? Did we want to go and do revisits with the intention of trying to understand what longitudinal research might tell us? But also the possibilities of can you go back to the same places? Because when you're going back to the same households, and we wrote a chapter on this in the book, is households change over time, communities change over time. So how do we understand change, and what do things like asset ownership, how livelihoods are different, how land holdings have changed, how the types of crops have changed? What does this tell us about the dynamics of wealth and well-being and the things that people value in their lives and livelihoods? So I can't remember if it was the kickoff now, but we had a really wonderful meeting at Usa River where we were collected together, just sort of ragtail bunch of us from the UK, the US, from Denmark, from Finland, from Tanzania. And we had this wonderful meeting with basically, you know, those of us who have been Tanzania files over a number of years and have had long engagements in the communities where we were based. So in my own, I work in Uchira near Moshi. It's somewhere where I first went in 1996 as an undergraduate, ended up doing my PhD research there, and then married into the village. And so I've had this very long connection with it. I did research around the Water Users Association, around agricultural livelihoods, did a lot of livelihood interviewing, and then this project gave me the chance to go back. And similarly, everybody else working in the book has had those sort of journeys, and that's why one of the last chapters is a reflection on that sort of research journey that we also had in the engagement and how we changed in relation to those places as well. So the book was really a project that works on very many levels, about us as researchers, about that engagement in the field, and with trying to understand how Tanzania has changed and evolved. And the meeting in Usa River was wonderful in the sense that we couldn't really pin down clear messages. We couldn't say Tanzania is wealthier than it was, because what did that wealth really mean? How are the assets that people value changed? But what was very clear was that in many places people revisited was that people seemed to be less poor. The social dynamics had shifted. Certain crops had really caused booms of certain asset classes, and people had become wealthier in the sense of owning more assets and having different types of livelihoods. So maybe now's the time to hand on to Emmanuel Sully to talk about his own case, which is really interesting in the sense that he also comes from the community that he's going to talk about.
Yeah, thank you so much, Anna. Is that okay with you, Emmanuel?
Yes, please.
Brilliant. Please go ahead.
Hello, everyone. It's really good to join in this really unplanned talk, because Dan just sent me a message yesterday. Can you join? I was like, what is going on? So, and I think the starting point for me is really when Dan Brackington asked me to communicate his interest to have endorsement from Professor Shivji. And Shivji read the book and called me and said, a lot of good essays, but the conclusions, And that was really the end. So I think this is a very good chat. And also I'm glad that Andrew Coulson is here, because I think those comments, as Dan once said in one of the meetings in Dar es Salaam, that he's planning to have a continuation of this book I think there's another book coming from another project that he's doing with Stefan Ponte and Christino. So literally, what I can also really emphasize with this kind of project, and that's where I will be heading on my chapter, is that for some of you that might have known me or not know, I actually grew up with this case study, because Catherine Snyder, whom I knew since 1990s, was doing her PhD in my village around those early 90s. So the growth, the changes that we are documenting in the case study in highlands of Mbulu, Mamaisara, the place Catherine called homeland, are the changes that I grew up with. So some of the issues that we have documented, from asset changes to behavioral changes in the community, is something that I witnessed. But it was really good to go back after many years of staying and studying in the US and South Africa to really assess how people describe wealth. And I think it's also important to understand from these kinds of longitudinal studies that the description, the understanding, and the vision of wealth varies from youth and the older ages, or the elders in those villages. And this is because the priorities, the assets that the old generation has kept as wealth, for example, in this case study in Mamaisara, is livestock. So for the elderly, the savings is made on the number of livestock you keep. But among the youth nowadays, the asset is actually trees. So you will wonder, why are trees valued by the young generation today? It's not that this issue is accidental, no, it is circumstantial. There are a lot of changes in the homeland. For example, during those old days when Catherine researched in 1990s and then back in 1996, 95, where she did a survey and assessed the household, the number of trees per household, there was enough space to graze livestock. But nowadays, the grazing areas, the commons, have been changed into individual farms. So individualization, even though the land titling doesn't actually apply in that area, has led into the diminishing grazing areas or commons. So that's why now it's easy for people to move towards planting of trees, because they can do multi-cropping or intercropping of crops and trees in the same farmland. But that also means a lot of diversification, but also a lot of sacrifice, what I can call, in different words, there's a lot of opportunity cost after replacing commons with farmland, because now some of the crops that cannot be intercropped had to be foregone, for example, millet and sorghum and some of these. So there's a lot of changes that have happened. So even the kind of assessment that we have done maybe sometimes may not draw a picture of some kind of things that people have lost in terms of nutrients. Some people are telling us how having sorghum or millet was so important to those days, but nowadays it's not there. But there's also changes that we are noticing among the youth, like farmland around the rivers are now no longer used to grow maize, but instead to grow potato, particularly what is famously called the Irish potato, because there's a lot of consumption of chips, and you can relate that to health and nutrition issues. So I think even though we have really documented and have excellent data that shows changes in assets, the other issues I'm sure that further research are needed in terms of nutrition, in terms of opportunity costs that people have. But certainly a lot has changed. But also there are two things that I think I can point out in terms of these changes in assets that we have documented and the livelihoods in the homeland. One is really that lives have changed, but the changes in asset has to be linked into broader changes in terms of policy. For example, we linked into the transformation that happened in a wider policy in agriculture. But also, it also tells us, because the homeland is really dominated by smallholder farmers who have no possibilities of mechanizing their farmland because of the terrain, being on the hills, being on the small flats that cannot be used by tractors, maybe modern tractors, I don't know, but there's no tractor there. It actually demystified the theories of large-scale farming as the best option to alleviate poverty among the smallholder farmers. So it really gives us a direction that smallholder farmers can actually produce if they get the support they need in terms of policy, in terms of access to markets, which is a big problem in Tanzania, by the way. The COVID time has really shown how policies can really diminish the opportunities of smallholder farmers, given the fact that some of these smallholder farmers' markets are actually external, like maize is really exported to Kenya, but any ban to export just cuts off their access to markets. Secondly, even though this part was not part of the green economy aspects that Dan and I are now looking at, what we can really say is that the increase, for example, in the number of trees that have been planted among households, we looked at the average trees per household was around 200 and above. So that was big change. Is that if someone now wants to look into the aspect and success of green economy, is that there is no one that is capturing these pockets of success among smallholder farmers, intercropping, reducing soil erosion, but at the same time increasing the number of trees, which are very central in the absorption of carbon dioxide in the air. So there are so many things I think that we can look on these publications just set a very good stage for further research. Just linking to other case study very briefly, and then I can stop there. One of the case study that is done by Monique from Katavi or Mpanda in around Lake Tanganyika and Rukwa is that really these kinds of intensive data collection that included all the villages in that area are unique. So this set of book and book chapters in many ways are unique, and they can be used as a baseline. I think as Dan, if he joined, will tell you how this was like a very first book of its kind in kind of documenting assets and bringing a huge data set in the history of Tanzania. So I think let me stop here and thank you for the opportunity to speak briefly.
Well, thanks indeed, Emmanuel. And if it had been relatively last minute, thanks in particular for a lot of in-depth insight there in terms of your understanding of the description of wealth and how it's changed and how it's varied amongst communities, but also the trends over time that you've observed. Just a quick question then, has Dan arrived? Is Dan Brockington in the Zoom call?
I don't believe so.
Doesn't appear to be so. Okay. Never mind. In which case, I'll go back to Anna's offer and kind suggestion that Anna, now perhaps we could look at your case study and delve into that before we pass on to Andrew and then go to the wider audience.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I won't say too much. I think Emmanuel's given a really nice analytical view of some of the sort of trends, but also these sort of wider concerns, and how I think I was always concerned that the book was not interpreted too simplistically as everything's brilliant and people are so much richer than we supposed they were, and that meant everything was fine. Because I think what we see within the book is so many subtle trends and dynamics between different generations, between different regions and areas. And so one of the reasons why my case study was a little bit of a contrast was because in many of the places the smallholder agriculture had made wealth gains, people had increased their assets, but we saw the extensification of land, in some places sort of deforestation as well. I mean, it was really, and the variability is really important as well here, because different geographies, different terrains, different areas experience different things very differently. And Uchira, where I'm based, is somewhere that had sort of, I suppose it had its sort of smallholder agriculture development before the period that I've worked in it, in the sense that what I saw of livelihoods in the 1990s is actually quite sort of similar differentiation as you still see today. So the way that livelihoods segment into who are the wealthiest, who were the middle, who were the bottom of the pile in terms of livelihoods was relatively similar across the time period that I looked at. So the poorest were reliant on, say, breaking stones in the village because there's a lot of quarrying activity. And the wealthiest capital owning class owned capital assets, they had bigger portions of land, they had much more diversification of production. So I didn't see huge change in that, but what I saw change of was an urbanizing place. So Uchira is relatively close to Moshi. So land is becoming bought for the urban dweller because plots are relatively cheap. And it means that the old people are coming into tension with younger people, because the best way to get resources for your old age and to look after your needs is to sell the family plots. And so increasing tensions about what I call the sort of urbanizing frontier around land sales, for example. And another thing that I observed, and differently to many of the other studies in the book, I was also looking at public services. So when I went in 1996, the village council essentially gave us this tour of all the community and village assets the different projects that they'd had in over the years, what had worked, what hadn't worked. And in the late 1990s, we saw this very vibrant, active village council, who then over the years that I've been engaged in Uchera seemed to lose their power and lose their sort of community ethos and ability to organize collective action to improve public assets and public services, for example, health services, education services. And I think that's quite an interesting reflection, as Emmanuel's just given, around sort of maybe increasing individualization and this sort of slight loss of collective life that seems to be happening. But also the extent to which actually central government support to development of those services is really quite limited. And the very big gap filling that goes on around NGO activity, for example, in somewhere like Uchera, close to Moshi. I think I'm going to stop there and hand over to Andrew Coulson, because I know he has some interesting thoughts and I want to leave time for discussion.
Thanks so much, Anna. In fact, I think Dan has now managed to join us, and so hopefully he can offer a bit of an oversight as well as to build on what you and Emmanuel have kindly done, before we then turn to Andrew. So Dan, are you now able to speak? And if not, can you just text into the chat so we can see which ID you're using, then we can unmute you. Let's see, Dan, because I'm getting emails from Dan, so I know he's in the audience. Dan, if you can hear, can you send a text into the main chat? And we can unmute you. Joys of technology.
Paul, I can speak if there's a problem.
Yeah, well, Dan does say he's in the audience, but for some reason I can't get through to him.
Hello, everybody.
You there?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hooray! I am so sorry for mucking you up with the technology. I cannot get my internet to allow me to get into the meeting. I'm in a place with rubbish internet, so I've phoned in.
Okay. All right. Well,
it's taken a while, and I'm very grateful to Anna and Sule for holding the fort. I'm very, very sorry to muck you around like this, folks. But I can now talk to you on my phone.
Well, please do, Dan. That's fine. If you could just go back to the original plan and give that sort of overview. I mean, actually, we've heard a lot from him, from Emmanuel Sullivan, from Anam Day already, but it'd be great for you to just give that kind of overview of your over picture, and then we can turn on to Andrew for his review. Thank you.
Indeed, and I heard a great deal of what both said, and I'm very grateful for them for doing so. So, folks, let me start by pointing out a basic fact about how we know about poverty and wealth in Tanzania, and indeed many other countries. And this derives from poverty line data. Poverty line data is calculated from the Household Budget Survey. This simply consists of a weekly survey which asks people what they have consumed during that week. And they will say 10,000 shillings on maize, and 2,000 shillings on meat, and 500 shillings on water, and 20,000 shillings on education, and so on and so forth. And from that, those household budget surveys, we know what people are spending per week. We also know what people are spending per day. And so the figure of living on $1 a day or $1.50 a day comes from those household budget surveys. However, when one is constructing a household budget survey, you cannot include expenditure on items which are part of your productive assets. So if you're a shop owner and you are spending $1,000 a week on shampoo and soap and clothing and soft drinks and beer and other things which you sell in your shop, you don't include those purchases in your answers because they're not part of your household budget. They're part of your business budget. What we count in the household budget survey is how the proceeds of the sales of those goods are then spent on the household. But it follows also that if you're a farmer and you are saving, for example, to purchase a plough and oxen and land and good implements for your farm and improved seeds and so on, all those purchases are not included in a household budget survey. And when we talk to Tanzanian farmers and we ask them what it means to be rich or poor, they will talk a great deal about the size and wealth of their farms and the investments they've made in those farms. But all that investment is missed out from the household budget survey. And what we have realized is that one of the curious things about the macroeconomic picture of Tanzania is that GDP has been growing quite dramatically, but poverty lines have not been shifting very much. A lot of poor people are staying rather poor. But this is in part because the things that they are investing in, the things that they count as wealth, are not included in the household budget survey. They cannot be. It's a wrong device to count improving investment in farms. And what we did in our study in this book, which is we're discussing here, is we went back to villages we have been associated with for 20 to 40 years, and we asked people about investment in their assets. And the picture is nuanced and is diverse. There are families and households which are aging, which are losing their powers, which are losing their ability to invest, and who are declining. They're becoming poorer. There are families who are not well placed to invest in assets. They don't have the economic base, the income, to allow them to build up the savings to invest in assets. But we also found many families, and this is the strongest impression that so many of us got in these different study sites, that were able to invest in their farms and in their assets, and were becoming wealthier in their own terms and by their own understanding. And this form of wealth was not being well captured by current surveys and hadn't been expected or appreciated by the survey, by the people conducting the surveys. For many of us, and Anna's villages is an exception, but for many of us, we were surprised by the levels of diversity and the spread of wealth through the village, and places that we had known to be poor and poorly connected and not well connected to markets and not growing many cash crops, were in fact doing all of those things and investing in trees or sunflowers or sesame or potatoes or livestock, or selling maize, and through those means are becoming much wealthier as a result. Now, when you get into the complexity of the class dynamics and you find which people are now selling their labor in order to build up savings in order to invest in their farms, and you get into the complexity of the gender dynamics, and you go to places like Meru, where coffee farms are being uprooted and replaced by carrot farming or banana farming, much to the joy and appreciation of women who weren't able to control the income of coffee farming and carrot farming. You get in those places, again, some of the nuance, because older men don't like these changes. They see this as an increase in poverty. Younger men who prefer carrots and women who have to invest of their labor in coffee appreciate these changes more. So we absolutely cannot tell a single story about this diversity and investment in assets, but we have to recognize that it's there, and we have to understand its impact on the dynamics of rural life. Let me stop there and give way to Andrew.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks for giving us that overview. I think it's interesting about perception. I think this also came up from what Emmanuel said about different perceptions from different generations. For example, the youth around giving trees more value than in the past, and of course a lot of this is around perception. But so I'd be interested in talking in a few minutes, having heard from Andrew, opening up the discussion around what are all the implications of all this, what do we do about it, and what sort of changes should this lead to, or what might it lead to in terms of what people want. But before we get to a discussion, let me pass over, please, to Andrew, please, Andrew Coulson, for your review and your
right.
Thank you.
Hello, everybody, and can I say how lovely it is to see so many old friends, but also to have so many potentially new friends from all over the world in an audience like this, which wouldn't have been possible without Zoom, and probably wouldn't have happened in this way if we hadn't had a COVID epidemic. So it is a wonderful thing that we're actually able to do. Can I just say, to introduce myself, that I was extremely involved in agriculture in Tanzania in the late 1960s and the first half of the 1970s. First of all, working as a civil servant in the Ministry of Agriculture, and then teaching about it to students at the University of Dar es Salaam. After I left, for about 30 odd years, I had very little involvement in anything, or knowledge of, really, changes in agriculture in Tanzania. But starting in 2009, I was able to go back regularly on short visits. And one of my first conclusions was that the official figures for Tanzanian agriculture were not bad. The official figures showed that production was actually, in GDP terms, production was actually growing faster than the population. So Tanzania was getting closer to being self-sufficient in its agricultural products. But also, I felt that the reality was almost certainly even better than the figures, because I knew something about the difficulties of compiling GDP figures for a rural population such as that in Tanzania. They don't properly account for non-marketed production. You have to decide what value you put on the food that people grow and eat themselves. Well, that's very difficult. They don't deal with non-marketed production very well when it's smuggled somewhere else, like coffee across the border into Kenya because there are higher prices in Kenya, or maize into Zambia because there are shortages and good prices there. Or for rapidly changing prices, like a glut of pineapples, or for collapses in prices, like tomatoes being left in the field and could well have been valued already by that time, but they're left in the field because nobody's prepared to harvest them because there's just no market for tomatoes, as I have seen near Morogoro in Tanzania. So there are real problems with GDP type count figures for the rural parts of a country like Tanzania. In fact, I remember when I worked for the ministry, we used to ring up district agricultural officers and ask them what was going on with agricultural production in their areas. Was the harvest likely to be better than it was the previous year? And if they said yes, then we increased the figures that they included for, say, rice by 10%. If they said no, we put it down a bit. And that was actually one of the main methodologies for creating figures of subsistence production, supplemented about once every 10 years by a survey of agricultural production, which perhaps surprisingly is not mentioned in the book, but is an important source of data, but only once every 10 years, and and has its own problems. Anyway, moving forward, when I was able to come back to Tanzania from 2010, and I've been on a lot of short visits since then, a lot of those instincts were confirmed at one of the early Rapower research workshops I went to, where the keynote speaker was the agricultural economist, unfortunately no longer with us, Hans Binswanger. And his advice was striking, if not perhaps fully understood by the audience at Rapoa, partly because they had problems with technology on the day he presented. He said, forget the traditional cash crops. The fibers like sisal and cotton are going to be replaced largely by synthetics. The beverages like coffee and tea are going to be overproduced and lots of new producers coming along. Even drugs like tobacco are going to be under great pressure and not a good long-term bet. Instead, go for the food crops, especially maize and rice, in which Tanzania can be competitive. In other words, it can sell especially to countries and near its own borders and sell within other parts of Africa, but actually could sell on international markets more widely. And I guess with the present situation of food prices and what's happening in Ukraine, that would be even more true today. I already knew in 2010 that something special was happening in the Southern Highlands. There'd been an article in 1986 which talked about a green revolution in the Southern Highlands, based not just on maize and rice, but also on Irish potatoes or round potatoes, which have indeed become a very interesting new part of the urban Tanzanian diet, which they certainly weren't when I first went to Tanzania. I can say that I knew something was happening. I don't think I ever guessed that the area close to Dodoma and especially close to Kongwa, which had the groundnut scheme, with a disastrous colonial project which failed largely because they didn't understand the weather and the possibilities of drought and the soils and everything else, that area would become one of the main centers for maize and big market villages which have big markets where they collect the maize together and it's then taken elsewhere. Of course, some of these changes which have occurred like that may or may not last. There are all sorts of things that could go wrong. But I also remember the Ismani area south of Iringa, which was a boom area for maize production in the 70s. And then soil erosion took over and it's now almost a desert area. And that could happen in Congo, it could happen in lots of other parts of Tanzania. Soil erosion is a lot of the soils are actually very fragile and subject to erosion. So I think this is very interesting research. This idea of researchers going back to villages that they worked in 20 years ago, and then from that, interviewing people and their successors, people they'd interviewed before or their families or successors, and documenting the changes that have occurred in those villages. And it certainly does show a huge amount of change, much of it in better houses, better implements, better transport, all sorts of changes which are documented in the book. I would just like to end by very quickly stressing some of the limitations of what we've got. So we're not just saying this is wonderful. I think it is wonderful, but I think it's got its limitations as well. So 4 limitations. First one is about geography. There are large areas of Tanzania which are not covered at all by this research. That was because Dan couldn't find researchers who'd actually researched those areas 20 years or more ago and kept their data. But it's very sad for something which is about Tanzania as a whole, not to have anything from the whole of the cashew nut growing areas of the coastal areas and the southeastern Tanzania, not to have anything from the far west and northwest, all those banana cultures, which have been devastated by root diseases and with enormous consequences for cultures as well as for food, of not having bananas when your whole lives and livelihoods were built around bananas. But nothing from those areas is in this research. And not having anything from the cotton growing areas of around Lake Victoria, where some would argue that artisanal mining is now more important than agriculture. And it would be very interesting to work through that. But again, without a study or studies from it, we can't say anything about it. I think that the declines that Anna talks about, and I think her chapter stands out in the book because it is the one chapter that definitely doesn't show progress. But I think if you look more widely, like I'm suggesting, you might find there are a lot of other areas that don't show a lot of progress as well. But the declines on Kilimanjaro are significant for all sorts of reasons. One is because they affect the national perspective on agriculture. There are so many Tanzanians in influential positions who grew up in and around Moshi and now send remittances to their parents or families struggling to survive on small plots, smaller and smaller plots, often with a cow and a very small amount of bananas with declining rainfall, overworked soils. And really there is a crisis of agriculture on Kilimanjaro, but that is just one part, and we should be very careful about generalizing from it. That's first thing is the coverage is very uneven, what I call geography. Second thing is there's almost nothing in this book about land grabbing, either by outsiders, companies coming in and growing biofuels and things like that, as studied by Emmanuel Sule, but others as well. But I mean, we know a lot about that, but it's not, none of the villages were affected by that. In fact, the only land grabbing in the village was the village that lost land because the government created a national park. So that's another form of land grabbing, when the government takes the land for a national project like a park. And there's nothing at all of what I think is the most interesting form of land grabbing of all, which is of Tanzanians who've got good money from working as civil servants or in business in urban areas, deciding to invest in their former home areas in agriculture and getting hold of often village land, manipulating the land laws in their favor to do so. This was researched by a Michigan State University team led by Thomas James, and published in 2016, but I'm not sure whether it's ever been followed up since then. I certainly haven't seen anything about it. So nothing at all on the impact of land grabbing, including land grabbing by the Tanzanian urban well-off people who can afford to do so. Thirdly, there's nothing at all about the climate crisis in this book, and maybe another edition would want to say something about it. Actually, the way that the climate crisis has affected Tanzania is quite complicated. It hasn't had devastating results. There haven't been completely out of control wildfires or colossal floods or big famines. It's been relatively kind, the climate has, over the past 20, 25 years. In fact, it's a bit like in the UK. There are some people who think, it would be nice to have a slightly hotter climate. We'll be able to sunbathe a bit more, and we don't like the cold winters. If they're not so cold, well, it's actually quite nice. And I think that there's been something of that in Tanzania, and some of the agriculture, especially things based on trees or very quick growing crops. One heavy storm will give you a crop regardless of when it occurs. And so if it occurs in an unexpected time of year, you can still get something out of it. So nothing at all on climate crisis. And finally, the point that I just made in my review just throw it in at the end, but I do think it's an interesting thought about the methodology. If you have a village that has a researcher that goes to it 25 years ago now, whatever it was, and then keeps in touch and goes back and gets very involved in the things happening in that village, then isn't it likely that that researcher himself or herself will have some influence on the development of that village? So isn't there a danger with this methodology that you bias the sample in favor of the villages because of in effect, the unintended success of the researchers in actually improving things for the people who live there? So I do think it's a lovely project, a lovely book. I've enjoyed reading it. I enjoyed writing the review. Anybody can't get hold of the review, there's a thing on that Janet put on the BTS website that gives the link that the publisher, which is the Review of African Political Economy, they've given me 50 copies. So if 50 people want copies, they can get it through that link. If it goes beyond 50, we'll have to go back to the publisher and get some more. But I think they'd do that. Publisher's view of it all is that BTS is a good way of getting publicity for their journal, and they welcome this. But I enjoyed writing the review, even though I haven't been. I'm very reluctant to speak at the beginning because it's not my research. It's I've not been part of the research. I've just been an observer, and I'm really pleased to see it and see it published.
Thank you, Andrew. Thanks so much for that, for your insights, both personal insights from over many years going back and forth to Tanzania, and that context, and the link between sort of what was an intuitive view and then how you observe that intuition coming into sort of the data. What I'd like to do is, we've got about 5 minutes till the hour, and I'd like to give 5 minutes to Dan and then to Emmanuel and Anna also, if they want to just respond to those issues around coverage and land grabbing, climate crisis, and the sample bias, if as much as they feel they'd like to at this point, for perhaps 5 minutes. And then I would really like to offer the last half an hour to a discussion and responding to various questions which I know people will have, and questions around what does this all mean, what are the implications, what sort of changes might this lead to, policy and in practice on the ground. So Dan, if you could just have a first run at this, and then Emmanuel and Anna, if you would also like to respond, please do after that, and then we'll open it up. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Paul. And can I check you can hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yes.
Okay, marvelous. Look, Andrew, thank you so much for these kind comments and for your insight into the book. This is a tremendous privilege to have you look over it so carefully. And most of my response, and I do want to make this very quick to give more time for questions, but most of my response is to say, yes, you are absolutely right. The geographical coverage is uneven. There are considerable agroecological zones which are simply absent. We, in fact, highlight that at the very beginning, because I think we're as concerned as you that telling these stories is an important task that still remains. And the absence of land grabbing did stand out to us as well. Tanzania has just announced the 4 new game reserves, which will displace tens of thousands of people. And there's all the, as you point out, all the investment by urban elites coming in as well. These will be very important dynamics in particular villages, and they are not covered in this book as well at all. So it's really important to draw our attention to that, and I'm glad that you've done so. But let me liven it up. Let me disagree. I don't think researchers would make much difference, actually. We're there for not very long. We don't really understand what's going on until many years into affairs. Let me turn it around. If a researcher has made a difference and has skewed the sample in some respects, I'd be astonished, somewhat delighted, but astonished that's the case. I think there are other more important dynamics at work. But apart from that very minor disagreement, all I can say is thank you for all that you said. Let me hand on.
Thank you, Dan, and for being a very succinct response. This is an opportunity then for Anna Mde and Manuel Sully to come in if you'd like to, before we open up. Would you please do open up your mics and jump in if you would like to? Emmanuel, please go ahead.
Thanks, Paul. And also thanks both Dan and Andrew. I think all your points are clearly heard and are very useful. Let me start with a question by Linda on the chat here. Linda is asking about what trees are valued for, whether for fruits, for green forage, for farm animals, for firewood, or timber. So the homeland, the case that Catherine and I studied and documented, trees there are really valued first for building materials, because this is a highland, it's received a lot of rainfall. So trees like pines, gravellia, they grow very fast. In 10 years, someone will be able to harvest pines for building. And most of these timber in Tanzania, for some reasons, have a huge market, not in booming urban areas like Arusha, Dar es Salaam, Dodoma, Morogoro, but also for export to Kenya. And something that I just found out is that Kenyans also do not consume all the timber they buy from Tanzania, they export to European, Asian, and so forth. So that's one reason on that. The other comments I want to also make with a land grab comment that Andrew raised. I think, yes, we didn't cover that, but I think it's also site specific. So if you look into the areas like the case of homeland in Tanzania, in Mama Isara that Catherine and I studied, there will be very little land grab by the elites. Certainly, even teachers are accumulating those who are retiring. But those big land grab from multinational corporations in Tanzania are really happening, for example, within the SAGOT, the Southern Growth Corridor of Tanzania, which I have covered widely. But again, it's also important that at the time that this book, people were doing a lot of research on this book, there was a lot of slowdown from international land grabbing that was happening around 2008, 2009, 2010 for many reasons that I cannot go into the details. And also, as I have also documented, biofuel investment in Tanzania collapsed. So literally, what we saw is that there was a biofuel boom and bust. So after studying biofuel in 2008, 2010, in 2015, I did another assessment in Southern Africa and Eastern Africa. Most of those jatropha, sugarcane, they are no longer focusing on biofuel. If it's sugarcane, it is on sugar and other things, and bioproducts will be used in case for ethanol and something else. But the focus on jatropha is dead. Jatropha is actually not a viable crop. So that was what we call it. Most of the investment in jatropha were speculative. So most of those companies have different interests. So that's really important. But I think from now on, Tanzania, we are talking on a different cases where there's a lot of militarization, so forceful eviction of like the Maasai, if you're following what's going on in Loliondo. If that plan is not stopped, then what we are seeing is that there will be a lot of land grab around the Maasai Steppe, which will involve 4 districts. And that will also mean that these evicted people will move to other areas, moving to the East Coast, to Southwest Tanzania, moving to Morogoro. That will mean a lot of competition among the land that are owned. But there's also programs that are leading into land grab, like these kinds of land titling initiatives that are funded by the World Bank and so forth. So it will also lead into the accumulation of the elites within the ruling party, businesses, and that will have different implications. So let me stop there. If there's a specific question, I'm happy to respond. Thank you.
Thanks, Emmanuel. Before I open up more widely, Anna, did you want to respond at this point, or otherwise we can
Yeah, I think I can just build on what Emmanuel's just said and really sort of responding to some of the sort of subtleties of these dynamics around land grab. It's certainly there was this sort of discussion that, you know, Emmanuel's just referred to, that there was this sort of land grab push, the multinationals and so on, but that actually what has happened is something much more subtle. And you've got these dynamics with the sort of political elites as well, and not in my case study, but when I was working at Mzumba University in Morogoro and looking at the Dakawa rice scheme and those sort of areas, there was a lot of land grabbing of the national ranch land by political elites that was certainly going on in that area, and the huge tension with the pastoralist population as well that we know causes conflict flashpoints in that area. And just a sort of final reflection on linking some of these dynamics around climate and the land issue is actually on Friday I was reading a PhD produced by one of Dan's students, which looks at carbon forestry and large international companies investing in sort of forest reserves and the dynamics that causes around land, and then not clear pictures around simply grabbing the land and impoverishing locals and shutting everyone out. This was dynamics revealed around some people doing well from the labor, people then planting their own trees and investing in these tree resources for the production of wood, but also thinking about this sort of longer term idea about carbon offsetting. And we have to think about that sort of difficulties, dynamics of the potential sort of climate colonialism that's actually happening around some of these sort of schemes as well. And these being things to watch as trends for the future as well. So I think I'll leave it there.
Super, thank you. Thanks, Anna. And prior to that, thank you, Emmanuel. I'd like to now offer the last 20-25 minutes for discussion, and obviously you can put quick questions you might have into the chat, which you might want to target at Dan or Anna or Emmanuel or Andrew, but you may also have something you want to jump in on yourself and to add to this debate and discussions around what do we think of this the implications, if you like, of this research and some of the trends that are emerging from it that we're hearing about. So perhaps, depending on how familiar you are with Zoom, just put your hand up or throw a chat into the messaging box, and I will respond and give you, as many of you, an opportunity to engage as possible within the time. Are we all sated with we had? Do we all feel like we've had enough of the conversation, or do we feel like there's particular areas around some of the questions that have been raised today that you might want to pick up on? Feel free to jump in. It's an open discussion. Just let me know. Okay, Sheila, we've got a question, and we've also got Anthony. So if we could start with Anthony, please. Hopefully the mic will be able to go forward, and then we'll have Sheila. And Janet, if you can give Anthony the chance to. Yep, thank you for that. Okay, Anthony, please go ahead.
Right, thank you. Thank you for the very interesting discussion. I'd like to take a bit further this question of land grabs, which it's a very emotive term. And as both Andrew and Emmanuel, in fact, Anna too, have emphasized, it covers a multitude of sins. I think that the key issue really is investment in the land rather than the grabbing. And the question is, who are the ones who are making the investment, and how far have the original targets of the research created the environment that has made this possible, and how far have they benefited from the further investment, whether it's by urban elites who originated in that area. I have one case study that I've been involved with for 60 years in what was Mbulu district, Karatu district now. I was manager of a cooperative farm there in early 1960s, and I've been following it with varying degrees of proximity since then. And what is happening is that the opportunities created by the original farmers have been grabbed by not by and large the next generation, but outsiders completely, who are bringing in money and expertise and squeezing out the original occupants and owners of the land or users of the land. And I don't know how far this is replicated in the other case studies covered in the book, but I would be interested if Dan has any comment on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. Dan, would you like to comment on this particular question?
Yes, the idea of land grabbing being an emotive term. And I recognise what you're saying, Anthony, and certainly there was a lot of attention on potential land grabs that were taking place that had to be, to some extent, reined back when it was realised that the land wasn't necessarily being removed from access from some Tanzanians. And again, I also recognise what you say when it comes to the importance of investment transforming land uses. But I would insist that where large areas of land are taken out of the reach of local Tanzanian farmers, that we have to be very wary of the detrimental consequences that this will have for them and their children. In the preparation for the SAGCOT investments, the Tanzanian government was surveying village land and coming up with participatory village land use maps. And their criterion for determining whether land was needed was whether it would be needed in 10 years' time. Which means that a child of 10 years old wasn't expected to be allotted their own land from the village pool, but because that land would have been made available to investors. This doesn't mean the investors took it, but nonetheless, that curtailing and foreclosing of the possible futures and possible resources for new generation of Tanzanians is a potentially very serious thing that we should be extremely wary of. Thanks.
Thanks, Dan. I also now would like to pick up on the question from Sheila Farrell, which I think perhaps Dan, if you'd be ready to respond again, which is about what has been the main effects of this increased availability of cash. What are those implications? If you could comment on that briefly before we'll turn to a question from Judy and then from Linda.
I can't see the chat, I'm afraid, Paul. But it is the question as you summarised it.
It is, yeah. What has been the main effects of increased availability of cash? Yeah, I can walk you through it. Yeah.
Well, we didn't see very much extra cash running through the village in terms of the liquidity or more people with lots of extra money to spend. Rather, what we see is people saving as much as possible, but saving successfully in order to invest in these new assets. And when we talked about the history of asset collection, we would ask people, how were you able to purchase this roof for your house or this new area of land? And they would explain which cash crops they'd sold, but they also talked about the painful, difficult experience of saving in order to invest in assets. I mean, it's written into our own language when we tighten our belts in order to make ends meet and invest in the future. And in Swahili, people would talk about tumebana matumizi. We restricted our uses. Chayanov, the great Russian analyst of peasant affairs, has a really filling phrase. He says that the most adapted peasant who knows how to starve. Because if you have a choice between eating or feeding your cow and securing your future for your herd, well, you make sure you secure your cow's future, because upon that will determine the health and prosperity of your future generations. So I think seeing this as increased cash and availability, it mustn't obscure from the fact that saving is difficult and painful, and Tanzanian peasants have successfully undertaken this difficult and painful task.
Okay. Yes.
Thanks.
Thank you, Dan. What I'll do, I think there's a few other questions. It's probably easier if I just read them out to you and you can respond, Dan. So the next question is from Judy, which is, are there any crops that could be promoted to improve nutrition for poorer Tanzanians? I don't know if this is something that you picked up on in going back into these longitudinal surveys and the research over time, whether any of those came out at you or in the case studies.
Not really, Judy. No, we didn't pick up a very much on nutritional crops being grown. In fact, I don't think anyone mentioned the importance, for example, of peanuts as an important cash crop. I don't know if Anna or Sule have anything different to say.
Anna or Emmanuel, Sule, do you want to jump in?
I just jump in. It's Andrew here. I mean, cassava is the traditional crop for those circumstances, and I'm actually quite a believer in cassava. I think it can be cooked in all sorts of different ways, and it doesn't have to be a last resort. And I mean, but millets and sorghums are also often talked about. So there are crops, and there are various fruits and vegetables as well that do very well in dry conditions. So I think it's not that these things aren't there. In fact, what we know from different studies, not necessarily this study, there's a huge knowledge amongst farmers and of all sorts of ways of helping to get through drought. My concern actually is, if anything, is that some of that knowledge is likely not to be transmitted. It might be lost and no longer there in another generation. I'm worried about the mechanisms for actually transferring that type of knowledge of folk ways of doing things from one generation to the next.
Yeah, no, thanks for that response, Andrew. There's another research-specific question here, Dan, from Dan Cook. Dan Cook, you can speak it out if you'd like to, or otherwise I'll just read it. It's just that Dan Rockington doesn't have access to I'll read it out. Was the research able to unpick what debt had been incurred in the buildup of assets? I believe that at a village level, there are numerous less formal ways of borrowing money. And my experience is that many are comfortable to take on debt when made available. Dan Brockington, could you give your thoughts?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. So yes, there is a lot of informal debt mucking around. Money lenders who are either lending money or giving people sacks of grain to get through the dry season. The interest rates on that are horrendous. So if you borrow one sack of grain, you pay back 2 in 6 months. I think that's 400% a year at annual rate. And there's also wonderful village loan groups. I was actually part of one during a sabbatical a few years ago, where the interest rate is lower, about 60%, and where people are lending to each other. There is a huge amount of loaning and debt involved in informal economies in Tanzania. We didn't take the histories of debt incurred in very much detail when we were doing these surveys. We did ask whether people had taken loans. It didn't feature massively, I have to say, in the reasons behind people incurring assets. As far as I recall, this was not an important part of the story, which it surprised me. Sometimes, though, I think what was one of the things that did matter was that people were able to get themselves out of cycles of debt and were able to pay off the debts they, which made it then possible to invest in their own assets. The other way in which this is manifest is that people talk about not having to do kibarua, casual labor, because kibarua, casual labor, when you do it for other people, it means you're investing your labor in other people's projects and other people's activities. And what people prized was taking the decision to take on casual labor if they needed to raise the money in order to invest in things rather than in order to meet day-to-day needs. But otherwise then being able to invest their own time and labor in their own projects, in their own assets, in their own farms, rather than other people's. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. Thanks. Interesting, Dan. Thanks very much. We've got a comment which is perhaps more wider than the research, but it might be worth delving into if we've got a few minutes, a little bit. Going back to the land issue. Linda, would you like to speak, or would you like me just to go through it? You're most welcome to, if we can give you access to the mic, to Linda Barker to ask your question, and we'll try and get some response from the panel.
I don't think she's here anymore, Paul.
Okay. I think it was quite a wide question anyway. It's perhaps a little bit wider than the research. Obviously an important one though. Are there any, we've got about 10 minutes. Oh, you can't unmute. Linda, Janet, could you help Linda unmute herself, please? Yeah, Linda, please go ahead.
Oh, hi, there it goes. I'm just curious how much the land grabs by the government, I think they said some of them were for parks, for example, how much the local communities are being involved with that and are benefiting from it. I mean, I see a lot of that, for example, in Kenya and in Rwanda. But are the proceeds being designated for local schools, teachers, health centers, for infrastructure? Are they encouraging, for example, truck farms to provide food products for the lodges, all those sorts of things? Are the local people just being displaced and have to move away, or are they being involved with the economic benefits?
Thanks, Linda.
Could we ask Phil to reply to that one, please, Paul? Phil, I'm sure
Yes,
your expertise.
I was just going to say that. Yeah, perfect. Okay, I was going to say the same thing. If you're there, Emmanuel, Sully, could you please respond to that question from Linda?
Thanks. Thanks, Linda, for raising this issue. I think, first of all, let's start with the proceeds from tourism in Tanzania. For some reason, Dan, I have worked on a paper that's really looked about what communities get from conservation initiatives or their own initiative to conserve. Yes, certainly if communities are engaging in, say, ecotourism, they benefit from lodges where they sell few things. But let's agree that most of the stuff that are consumed in tourist, particularly high-end tourism sector, lodges, tented cabins, are still either imported or are from the urban areas, not necessarily from rural areas. I went to Serengeti district, Mugumu area, where there's a lot of women SACCOs. These are, they call Kokoba community conservation banks, literally started to ensure that communities have enterprises that can help them engage with conservation. But these communities or women groups cannot sell chicken to hotels in Serengeti because most of the owners actually import chicken as far as from Brazil. So forget about those who are displaced in many ways. For example, those in Loliondo, if you are kicked out and you go out, that's up to you, I think. But there are circumstances like those whom government claim to have moved voluntarily out of Ngorongoro to Msomera village in Handeni district, they are likely to get a house, three rooms house, and maybe a borehole, maybe a school. But there's a lot of contestation. In fact, there are evidence that people are producing that most likely those who are willingly living out there are actually former retirees of the Ngorongoro Conservation Area Authority and some other tribesmen or women who have moved to that area, including Iraq and others. So not necessarily the typical Maasai, but those information may be contested at the moment. So those kinds of new infrastructure for evicted or displaced people are still not that in order yet. But what we actually want to emphasize is that our Tanzanian laws, from the constitution to land law, are very clear. If you take a piece of land, those people have to be compensated or given an equivalent piece of land to the one that they have given up for the project of great importance to the nation. So that's like building infrastructure. But unfortunately, that's not the case most of the time when people are displaced for giving land for new national park or game reserve area. And then I want to add one thing on cash, extra cash. Dan gave a very good description, which is really useful. I think even in the book, we have explained that most people are using the revenue they're getting nowadays to build modern houses, maybe iron sheet or corrugated iron sheet for their house. But we also looked into details, for example, in my case study, why are people building houses with iron roof? One explanation also has to do with the lack of the traditional materials that they get from plain areas or around the rivers, because most of these rivers or plains are now turned into farmland. So you are forced to put iron sheet on your house because you can't sustain getting the materials every year that you have to replace after 2 or 3 years. So there are so many changes that people are doing because they can afford to get that. But in terms of dates also, we also looked in the case study whether people are using those traditional means of exchanging livestock and giving you a livestock like a cow for a year, you harvest a calf. Those things are now narrowed. So there is increase into Vikoba, village community banks, or these other types of microfinance at that level. And they're actually costing a lot among the women because for some reason they're the one taking a lot of these loans. So at the end of the day, most end up even selling their land or other properties at home at their households, causing into other conflict between men and women now. So let me stop there. Thanks.
Thanks, Emmanuel, for responding on both of those points. We're into our sort of final few minutes. I'm not sure whether we have particular time to go into any more depth on anything else, unless there's a very quick comment or something that someone wants to say. We could do that. Otherwise, I'll move to closing up. If there is, please let me know immediately. There's always a bit of lag on Zoom with the comments and the hands and everything else, but
could I just jump
Dan, if you please do.
Thank you so much to the organisers for setting this up. It's a tremendous privilege to be able to put this book out to an audience like this. I do wish I'd been there right from the very start, but nonetheless, I'm so glad that this has been able to go ahead and we've been able to give this a thorough going over. And thank you to all the participants, to Andrew, to Anna, and Sule, and yourselves for setting it all up and taking part.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks for giving us a worthy subject to get our teeth into today. Well, on that note, and thanks for those closing points, Dan, I will bring this to a close. We are recording this, so we shall share the the link after it for those who've registered, so you'll be able to delve into this if you can get, particularly if you missed it at the beginning or you came in late or anything like that. I just do want to say again, this is Britain Tanzania Society event, but we're a friendship society between the UK and Tanzania, but we're also delighted to be joined by quite a few representatives from the United States today, from Friends of Tanzania, and very pleased we are about that too. So let's keep these discussions going and look forward to more webinars, more discussions in future, and stay in touch with the society.
And Paul.
Yes.
Sorry, and again, so just in case colleagues on the call don't realize, the book we've been talking about is available for free. You can download a PDF of the whole thing from my website, and I think from the links you've circulated already. And if anybody did have questions they weren't able to ask, or others come to them afterwards, do email me the questions. I shall be very keen and happy to respond to them.
Oh, that's a super addition. Thanks a lot, Dan. Thank you. Yes, Linda, missing Tanzania, absolutely. All right, well, thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining. Thanks for getting stuck in. Thanks for your interventions. Thanks particularly to the panel, and for everyone for getting involved. Asante sana. Thank you, and talk to you all soon. Thank you. Bye now.